So the idea of the dangerous classes that we were mentioned earlier on, they get more into detail in this concept, or are thinking about this um, as the chapter progresses. There's a couple of different figures that they mention: the peasant, the poor, the migrant, all this kind of thing, right? So we want to maybe talk a little bit about all of them, but to talk about the peasant first. I think it's really interesting. Like, we'll get to this in a second. Like, why go to these sort of strange, marginal figures that don't even feature very well or very profoundly or centrally in the history of left-wing struggles? Right? They are supposedly left-wing guys, So why would they not focus on the traditional sort of figures like the industrial worker, for example, as being usually the most considered by the left, the figure that's most empowered to do anything about the world, the condition of the world. Why start with the peasant? It seems very strange, especially as they concede the peasant is typically considered to be a kind of a conservative figure, a kind of a bumpkin, where the peasant has political views. They're usually narrow, oriented towards the land or the past. They're very simple. And indeed, Stalin's political program resulted in their total elimination. I mean, when Stalin wanted to engage in industrial farming, he pretty much reorganized the rural workforce and set them all up as a sort of agricultural factory line worker or assembly line worker. And so the peasant all but disappeared, probably in the one part of the world Western world anyway, where they'd been very prevalent up to that point, which was in Russia. But it shouldn't be denied that the same fate, or a very similar fate, awaited the peasant in capitalism as land was sort of monopolized over time, purchased up, and we left behind the era of the small peasant holder. And we now have large-scale industrialization of farms through just large-scale farming. So why, if the peasant is sort of disappeared, but there are parts of the world where the peasant still exists, especially in the third world, and there's some consideration here of the difference between the sort of the low peasant, the middle peasant, and the high peasant, and all this kind of thing. And you guys can go and obviously read that in your own time if you want, and that's it's all useful stuff. But the point, just to sort of speed through all that, is that the peasant, even in this sort of third world sort of sense, is still kind of increasingly going to be shaped by this tendency that they're saying is going on all around globalization, which is the encroachment of biopolitical labor. And that's a good thing in some ways, because if you think about it, one of the reasons why Stalin and others may have looked down their nose on the peasant, and even Mao, who's considered to be kind of a hero of the peasant revolution, in his early days, he also looked down his nose at the peasant a little bit, was because, frankly, the peasant didn't really have a lot of potential. The industrial worker, for example, had a huge advantage in terms of his ability to engage in cosmopolitan communication with his fellow worker in the structure of the workplace. The workplace brought together workers from different contexts, backgrounds, and transformed them into proletarian laborers. So without that kind of structure bringing together peasants and giving them the opportunity to communicate with each other and exchange forms of knowledge with each other, then there's not really much point in looking to them as kind of somehow a helpful figure, or signifying or indicating any sort of advantage in the struggle, so to speak. But as Hart and Negri note, Mao's views eventually changed, and he began to see the peasant in this new kind of a way, as a sort of a raw potential. And it's for that reason, and it's in that note that Hart and Negri suggests that the peasant today is a paradigmatic figure. And we're going to get more into this in a second when we talk about poverty and the figure of the poor later on. But for now, the peasant, of course, has, again, this sort of, just to think about it, the type of knowledge, you got to think about the type of knowledge that the peasant has about the land, the fact that the peasant was already engaging in effective types of labor. So in a way, the peasant was already biopolitical before anyone else was in some respects, but the fact is that with new technologies, new ways of doing things creeping in, that biopolitical potential is becoming very robust and powerful now. And so we should not play down the role of the peasant. There's a little weird moment then in the chapter where they start talking about two Italians in India, and it's not really clear why they would do this there at that particular moment. I think they're trying to prepare us or set us up for something that they're going to talk about later on. And it's a debate that sometimes happens. It's happening, for example, right now vis-a-vis the financial crisis, where people are asking, do you want to think about the Greek financial crisis, the Italian, the Spanish, the Irish, the American financial crises as singular instances, or do you want to think about them in the context of a global crisis, a global capitalism? And there's good reasons for both. The Irish financial crisis is different to the Greek financial crisis, even though they're both crises, if you will, of global capitalism. So you need to sort of figure out the specificity of the Irish financial crisis if you want to talk about it in any meaningful way. And then other people would say, yes, but don't get too caught up in the specificity, because if you do, then you will forget about the fact that the crisis would not have happened were it not for the fact that there is this thing called global capitalism, and it is forcing these local conjectures to change how they've legislated their economies, and there is a kind of a harmonization that's been going on between a lot of them. They are unique, they have specific ways of doing things, but they are increasingly sort of common in their way they're doing things. So once we recognize singularity, say Harteneggery in this section, which is very short, the common begins to emerge, and I think then they just sort of wanted to just sort of mention that there, because it sort of sets up something for later on. But in the meantime, we've got to get back to talking about our dangerous classes. So, excuse me. The wealth of the poor, then, if we've talked about the peasants, now we're going to talk about the poor. And the poor are an interesting figure. Again, they're very marginal, but they argue that the becoming common of all labor does not necessarily exclude these traditionally conceived as marginal creatures, the poor. Vanguardists, that is the sort of a Stalinist to sort of a top-down model of fighting and struggling for communism, would have castigated the poor as the lumpen proletariat, pretty passive and pretty useless. But in fact, Harteneggery say that the poor are a very special entity here, and in fact, really, as we'll see later on, they're kind of emblematic of the struggle or the plight of the multitude, really. If there's any one figure that seems to inspire Harteneggery's understanding of what the multitude is or how it's significant or special, it is the poor. So we're going to have to keep our minds open to this as we're reading the book. They're not just passive victims. In fact, the poor are central to the work of the common. I don't see necessarily Harteneggery saying exactly this, but in my sort of little sort of scenario in my head that I'm building here of what they understand the poor to be, an image pops to mind. An image pops into my mind, at least, of the poor as kind of basically the bubbling cauldron of creative essence at the center of humanity. There's a real sense that Harteneggery believed that real creativity, real potential, this work of the common that we've been talking about, it's all there in the poor, right? I mean, think about this for a second. When Harteneggery talk about the work of the common, we said a little bit about this last week, and we're talking about it again this week effectively. language, this Nike swoosh thing we talked about a minute ago as being very important, where does that come from? It comes from the capacity to engage in language. It comes from the very human capacity that, you know, is very different to the kind of working capacity that workers brought to the factory in Marx's time. Today, as we see the factory, life distinction has fallen down, and now we're working not just in the factory but in our lives as well. And we're working because we're tapping into very human capacities in order to do simple things like sustain the value of a brand, or to even take up sometimes, for example, if we're volunteering, we're working as well. We're adding value to society in our capacity as volunteers. So that's actually a very increasingly prevalent form of activity in this type of capitalism that we're living in today. So so we're all kind of at work in the common, and we're all engaging in the type of work that the common creates. But have we said yet why it's work in the common? I don't know. I think the point when you say the work of the common is to note that, look, I mean, nobody owns this stuff. Like, no one owns the ability to care for someone or the ability to feel sympathy for someone. You can't privatize that, right? So, I mean, you can try, and a lot of the common is being privatized, but language can't really be privatized per se. A lot of scientific language ends up being privatized, but in the bubbling cauldron at the center of humanity, which is the poor, you know, it's a very unpredictable place. All kinds of things are getting thrown out of there, and sometimes it sticks and sometimes it doesn't stick. But one thing that Hart and Negri talk about in this chapter that I think is very telling is the you know, for example, African American language, and how it bubbles up and becomes popular in the vernacular as well. You know, how you know, terms from African American culture end up becoming the terms of everybody's culture. And, you know, so there's a creativity there. Even though there's a lot of poverty there, there's a tremendous creativity, and our lives are being enriched by this language and the terms and the concepts that it's inventing and contributing to our world. So language is the common, yeah? Emotions are the common, and the work of the common is being done in the bubbling cauldron of the poor at the center of humanity, not just in the more rarefied heights where we think important work's going on, like in the high-level offices of large corporations and that kind of thing. You know, it's not just Steve Jobs, in other words. I mean, that's actually a really useful way to think about it. Steve Jobs is, of course, the person that everybody sort of was lamenting as having, you know, passed away and everything. And, you know, it was thought that a tremendously creative force had passed from the earth, and, you know, the iPhones would become shit overnight kind of thing, you know, because he was no longer there to exert his personal power over the creative potential of the company. But of course, creativity doesn't really work like that. It's not just the work of one person, it's the work of a multitude, and that's what Hart and Negri are getting at here when they're talking about the wealth of the poor. Just continuing then on this sort of points about the wealth of the poor, and some of the reasons why we're taking the poor so seriously, is a lot to do with the fact that, you know, once upon a time, you know, they were just seen as like a passive reserve of the left wing would have seen them as almost like a threat, you know, to the pure soldiers of the left, which were the working class. If their precious jobs were undermined by anyone, it would have been by the fact that the poor were there as a reserve, a standing reserve of labor, ready to take down the living standards, the working standards, and dignity of the workers. But because of post-Fordism, which is the situation we're living in today, the reality is that you know, so many of our contracts have become flexible. So many of us are sort of precarious workers today. On the one hand, that it's not clear where this sort of idea of a hardcore of the industrial workers would sort of be found anymore, right? So that category seems to have passed on the one hand, right? The industrial army. And on the other hand, the reserve, this so-called reserve or threatening reserve, doesn't really seem to be a problem today either, because even those who aren't working are working from Hardt and Negri's point of view, right? Those who are unemployed are still, because of what we've said about the bubbling cauldron of the poor, they are engaging in production, right? They are creating new languages, new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. They are the sort of hardcore, actually, of where the production seems to be going on today in many respects. And in this sense, the poor are rich, right? They are productive. They are essential to human survival, human adaptation to things that are coming along that are unanticipated. The poor are more than just the sort of like the poor aren't just people who don't have stuff, right? For Hardt and Negri, the poor is this term, and we'll get to this at the conclusion. But the poor is this category of philosophical category as well as everything else. It's not just it's not referring just to people. It's referring to sort of a philosophical potential that we find in the literal poor, but I think we find it throughout the multitude as well. This model of what distinguishes the poor is distributing because of biopolitical production throughout the planet, right? Because we're getting poorer in the literal sense, and then we're finding ourselves more and more having to share this sort of this trait of the poor, which is their productivity. Another threatening subject that comes up is the migrants, right? They are also rich. But what's their wealth? Well, their wealth is the desire for something more, their refusal to accept the way things are. And we see that on page 133. So, of course, similarly to the poor, migrants are also miserable in terms of the stuff they have, right? They don't have a lot, but in terms of their being, they are overflowing. They have abundance, right? So, and you can see this, and I think when Hardt and Negri talk about the abundance and the energy of the poor or the marginalized, the migrants, right? I think they really sort of hit it right here, because elsewhere it's maybe a bit vague, but here I think it really gets interesting. This bubbling cauldron that I mentioned a minute ago, right? This here with the migrants, you see it very, very clearly. In terms of being, the migrants are positively overflowing with creativity. So in the anti-poverty protests in Durban, South Africa, for example, we see the slogan, "We are the poors." Not "we are the poor," but "we are the poors." And here we have a political voice, right? This is shocking, because the left is notorious for looking at the migrants and looking at the poor as not really having much to do with anything, right, in terms of a struggle. They're almost more of a problem than anything else. So you trip up over them as you're trying to do important things. But the poors here, this notion of the poors, this suggests to Hardt and Negri a fantastic sort of resilience, a vitality, a political savvy, an ability to articulate what it is that they're really chasing with the multitude, right? Because when they say, here's the poor looking for better salaries and minimum wages for everyone, for literally even for people who aren't working, in a country where welfare isn't a very common thing, not like it is in other developed countries. And yet we find this claim that we are the poorest. We're not coming here as one singular. Remember, like I said, go back to the start of the chapter. We were talking about the crowd. We were talking about the masses, and we were talking about the people. And all of these things were kind of singular and passive. And here we see why Hardt and Negri are talking about that, because the poors are emblematic of what the multitude concept is all about, right? The ability to find difference within the common, or singularity within the universal and the shared, and not wanting to sort of wrap everyone up in the common banner of this or that type of project, to acknowledge that there are multiple projects, multiple agendas within the movement that we present at your doorstep here. So that's very, very interesting, and we got to keep that notion of the poorest, I think, in mind as a result of that. For Hardt and Negri, these wealths are going to be the crucial thing, right? These wealths of the multiplicitous are going to be important, and Lord knows we need new wealths. They're suggesting, because the trade union era is over. It's blocked. Their trade union membership is down in the United States dramatically compared to 40 years ago. It's really been a precipitous drop. Trade unions are no longer popular in America. They're frowned upon. They're seen to be more of a problem than anything else. They seem to represent particular interests, vested, narrow local interests of particular sectors of workers. Gone is the day where the trade unions represented workers in the round and were seen to be sort of champions or heroes of the general. Now they are seen as champions and heroes of the specific, and almost akin to mafias or criminal gangs sometimes. So Hardt and Negri invite us to look elsewhere, right? To look to these things that used to be thought of as only passive, and I think Hardt and Negri are saying, and these are my words, not theirs, but I think the sort of Hardt and Negri see the poor as basically the shock elite, the new shock elite of the left agenda, and it's in the common. It's in the sort of in the category of people that are closest to ground zero, as Hardt and Negri call it, of the common, that you will find the potential for heroism and leadership and all this kind of thing. But it won't be heroism and leadership in the sort of classical sense. It will be horizontally organized and leaderless, perhaps, and spontaneous and creative. These are sort of the things that we might expect to see coming forth from the poor. I'll skip the comments about the Gerasene demoniac for a minute because it's a bit abstract, but if you're interested in biblical scholarship, that's something you might want to look into there. So just sort of wrapping it up now, finally, we enter into the excursus. And the excursus is a bit repetitive maybe of some of the things, but it does put a nice capstone on a lot of the things we've been looking at in this chapter. We see a discussion of Marx's method, the historical tendency, the real abstraction, antagonism, and the production of subjectivity, and all these things they get from studying Marx's texts like Kapital and the Grundrisse. So in each of these items, we have we see each of these items represented in basically what we've just been discussing throughout the chapter as well. So there is more to be said, I think, about the method and the real abstraction, and then antagonism and production of subjectivity are perhaps not as fleshed out here. But let's start with the tendency. Now, if you've ever taken a political theory class, Marx famously poses the dialectic argument about why history is sort of moving in a certain direction, and why he's predicting that at the end of the day, it will be the proletariat that will win in history, right? Because they will be the champions of the final stage of history where communism is sort of created. And for that reason, people say Marx is a determinist, right? And what does determinism mean? A determinist is someone who specifically thinks about forces external to human decision making as being determinate in history. From Marx's point of view, the advent of communism is inevitable. It doesn't matter what people want. It matters what the material forces in the base of society are pushing us towards. And Against that understanding of Marx, Hartenegger suggests that there is another Marx, a Marx that was more about tendencies, and we've mentioned that before. But what I think Hartenegger bring to the table in this particular breakdown of this point about tendencies, which again we've already spoken about, is the fact, for example, that they're willing to bring a very interesting example into the argument, and it's the argument we saw earlier, the specificity versus universality debate, which we saw in the two Italians visiting India section. Except here it's not the Italians visiting India, it's Descartes, the famous philosopher, who said, "I think, therefore I am." And they ask a question, like, so what's shaping Descartes' decision to write this? Where are his thoughts coming from? Is it something specific to his specific situation, or is it more the fact that he's caught up in a particular time and a place, socially speaking? And they're saying both are true, right? That the specific argument and the universal argument are both present. And again, they're saying, just as they said before, that it's kind of a false debate to get stuck into, whether it's specific versus universal, whether there's an Irish financial crisis or a global financial crisis. Doesn't really make that much of a contribution if we get stuck in that debate, although obviously there's interesting things that can be said. But what's really interesting for Hartenegger about Descartes is that he recognized, as they say in the quote, a form and mode of thought that corresponds to an entire era. That there was, even in his specific philosophy, what he was tapping into was a tendency. What he was expressing was a tendency that was already going on throughout his entire society, not with everyone that was there, but even though only a few people were saying it at the time Descartes was saying it, eventually it did become a hugely influential notion, which is the idea of a sort of a rational individualistic a rational individualistic subject of political action and or philosophical action. I've not got, I would concede, a huge background in reading Descartes, but the whole point of Descartes, so far as I'm aware, is that he was trying to prove the existence of the mind, and that based on this existence of the mind, once you could sort of prove one thing, you could therefore go ahead and start to prove other things existing, because you have established a sort of a reference point from which the rest of reality can be ascertained. The nature of the rest of reality can be ascertained. And it's this idea of a sort of a rational kernel or center of thought, or center of logic, logos, if you will, that Descartes is sort of famous for having articulated. But for those of you who studied international relations with me in other classes, you'll know that that model of thought later becomes generalized to say the marketplace, to the nation state, to other things. So Descartes' thought is a tendency much the same as Marx is trying to identify. In the universal, there are specific instances, but the specific can contain artifacts of the general, and those artifacts are important if you want to understand how society is changing, inflecting the direction it's going. And you could apply that to the Irish financial crisis. That is our little case study that we've been discussing here and there. You'd want to look there to see what sort of unique, specific things are going on, which are shared with the other countries, and you could start to derive maybe some tendencies from that. So the next point is about real abstraction, and this is, I think, something that Marx is quite known for. One of the things he really hated was the sort of Robinson Crusoe myth, and of course, Robinson Crusoe was the guy that got stuck on the island, and he is an influential figure for people like David Ricardo and Adam Smith, who used this metaphor of Robinson Crusoe to sort of speak of the individual as the source of labor, as the source of value production. Okay. And what infuriates Marx about the example is that it's completely historically useless to us, because Robinson Crusoe is a very isolated individual, and he doesn't really resemble much of the rest of us, because we're busy in society all the time. So why would you start with Robinson Crusoe when it's very, very clear that the source of productive value, productive labor, is not this sort of abstract individual, but rather an abstract social basis of labor, right? The thing we should be trying to sort of put forward is what is it behind society, if you will, that allows for true, genuine creativity to stem forth. Remember this bubbling cauldron that I mentioned before? And what they're suggesting is that it's that one thing that we could identify as being part of the social common is language itself. Now, Marx is aware of that, and certainly wants to go, and does go to great lengths to try to describe ways in which you could get back to a society that would sort of be faithful to that idea of a social basis for value production. But Marx had something in his advantage that we no longer can draw on, insofar as Marx had the ability to sort of figure what this social wealth was worth by looking at how it was expressed within the confines of the factory, and to figure out how value was being expropriated from it unfairly within the confines of the factory. He's sort of able to reverse engineer the factory encounter to offer us a definition of what social wealth must be, therefore be worth. Once you find out what the rip-off is that the capitalist pulls over on the worker, then you can add that sum that's ripped off to the value of the wage received by the worker, and then there you get an idea of what society's actual value is, right? You get a sense of what all this labor is actually worth. But in a post-factory society, where, as we've said, it's hard to measure the amount of hours, for example, that we work, when I'm having some of my most interesting thoughts on the toilet or in the shower. Creative work, creative intellectual work, affective work doesn't just happen in the working hours. And so we have this blurring of the working day, and that means we're in trouble, because we don't have the reliability of the narrow confines of the working day to work with here. So we don't have the advantage that Marx had. And then, of course, there's the fact that there's another trouble, that we don't fully know or understand yet the extent to which capitalism is able to capture for its own selfish needs the value production that takes place in this post-factory society. We know that the capitalist used to play a very significant role, but now we feel that the capitalist maybe plays less of an important role. He's not there coordinating what's going on within the factory walls as he used to be. In fact, if anything, he is perhaps more redundant, because as the example of the externalities that's given here suggests, value is kind of spontaneously emerging now from self-organizing forms of activity. The idea of the value of my property, if it's located in one part of the world versus another, and that being much to do with the kind of people that live in my neighborhood. For example, if I live in a very desirable neighborhood, why is that neighborhood desirable? It's because of the people that are there, the type of class of people, and so my bricks and mortar home is probably worth a certain amount of money in terms of bricks and mortar, but it can go on the market for much more than that. Not because of anything internal to the property, but because of something external to the property. And the question is, are we fully aware that that's the nature of the society that we're living in today? And how should we go about, again, Marx had an advantage when he was, when Marx was trying to deal with the real abstraction, the real abstract living labor of his era could be measured. He had a much greater chance of measuring it. But we have these troubles. We have the trouble of measurement in terms of hours, because we don't know when we're working and when we're not working, and also excess, because we don't know exactly what role we don't know exactly what's been taken and what's not being taken. We know a lot's been taken, but we find it hard to sort of express it in a quantitative sense. Because so much of the value of the things around us seem to be crowdsourced, to use a popular phrase. How do we measure when what we're really making is this very vague, ephemeral notion called a commonwealth? And it's no less real, but it is vague and it is ephemeral, and it's hard to know what it is, except in a qualitative sense. It's not certainly very little chance of measuring it quantitatively. And so that brings us to the question then, now that we've talked about the method, now that we've talked about the real abstraction and the difficulty of talking about abstract and measuring abstract labor today, now we have the antagonism. Exploitation was based on stealing free hours from the worker, but today the common is being privatized. The question is to sort of figure out the battlefield, if you will, and the battlefield for Marx was within the confines of the factory, as we've said, and so it was there that the capitalist stole free hours of labor from the worker by getting the worker to compete with his or her brothers and sisters, by reducing the value that person was willing to ask for in terms of a salary in exchange for work, and that was a form of exploitation. But today we look for around us and we see much more complex forms of exploitation going on. We see the common as being privatized in all kinds of interesting ways. We see, for example, indigenous knowledge. We see seeds, genetic codes. Genetic codes, of course, are common in multiple ways of construing that. Genetic code of a seed is something that belongs to the seed, you might think, in some ways, and certainly to the extent that the information about the code exists, it's very hard to say that one company can own the code to a seed when so much work has been done by so many different people around the world to figure out genetic science, and how do you establish what percentage of the code, the value of the code, belongs to the company and how much of it belongs to the public? Many people would make arguments that all genetic knowledge, given the amount of scientific work funded by public universities and carried out by private individuals in a non-for-profit basis, it's hard to know how much of this companies can legitimately be able to claim that they produced. Barack Obama got in trouble for this kind of thing before the campaign, when he was saying, you didn't make that, and people laughed at him. But I think in the case of genetic science and seeds, clearly he's right, that the companies did not make the seed, right? They did not make the genetic code. They might have jiggled a little piece of the genetic code around so they could claim that they innovated this particular sequence of the code. But, how do you claim that that's full ownership? It's strange, but it is significant because, of course, based on the ownership of that seed knowledge, the companies are able to exploit revenues or extract revenues from farmers in the third world, who now have to rent seeds, to contract our subscription model to rent seeds from companies, as opposed to just reusing the seeds, which is what they used to do once upon a time. So if that's the antagonism, then we have only one question left to ask, and that is the question about the production of subjectivity. The worker subjectivity is created in antagonism, as we know, but today the poor capture this antagonism better than anything else. And we've been making that argument earlier, but here it is more concretely, I think, where Hart and Negri, I think, are, if I understand this correctly, what they're doing is they're putting the poor at the very center of their definition of the multitude in terms of its form, right? They're not literally saying the multitude are poor in that sense of not having anything. They're saying the multitude are poor in terms of being excluded yet included, right? Because of course the poor are excluded from the decision making about what's going on in the marketplace and how resources are allocated, yet they're included insofar as they are a very valuable source of productivity. Remember, they're the boiling cauldron at the center of humanity in the post-Fordist era. They have nothing, but they are everything for us. They're the source of what we do. They're the source of our potential. And I think because of that, this sort of raw potential is something that should keep us on our toes as we read the rest of the book, because it seems like Hart and Negri are almost sort of imbuing their definition of the multitude with this sort of semi-spiritual or divine power. And that might be off-putting for some people. I don't know, but certainly it'll be very interesting to see what they do with it. But we had to talk about this in this lecture because the multitude aren't just like a bunch of people coming together demanding democratic rights. They're not just even a bunch of people coming together in their internal diversity. We are the poorest, right? They're not just even this multitude coming together in diversity demanding rights. They are, in fact, because of the realities of biopolitical production, a specific type of iteration of a democratic movement that is diverse in its totality or universality, clearly, but it is also different qualitatively than the working class was before. It is literally a movement that is now struggling mightily against capitalism for autonomy in the face of tremendous challenges to the common. And it is this struggle over the common that I think Hart and Negri believe is sort of defining the coming political clashes of our era and of our time. Interestingly, this book was written a long time before the Occupy movement came along, but clearly there's something kind of predictive about that encounter, that moment of antagonism. It very much sort of fits into this idea of if you look at like how Occupy was talking about being indebted and how debt was a problem when students were being asked to literally put their entire lives into to debt in order to get an education, and they'd literally have to sort of rent because they'd be so in debt by the time they finish their education, they're literally renting their life from the banks, so I think that's interesting too. Anyway, that's it for today. More next week, and thank you for your time.